Good afternoon. We are organizing today here at the AIReF a seminar focusing on debt sustainability. I would like to welcome also to those who are here present in the room, those who have connected via internet, via joining us through our web. This is actually the first time we are going to do this facility. Hopefully it's going to work smoothly. We have already tried with journalists, but this is the first time we do it with seminars, so I expect that everything runs smoothly in the connection to those who are joining us via live via our web. Actually, there is, just for the record, I have seen that there are registrations from 12 countries today, from nearly 15 public institutions, primarily independent fiscal institutions like the one us. For those who are not here, they should also know that they have also the possibility to raise issues and put questions on to the panelists via the internet as well. I mean, this facility, they can do it in writing, and we will translate it to the speakers. So I encourage you, those who are joining us from outside, to do it. This is a seminar which is related to the efforts that we are making from the AIReF to bring together policymakers, researchers, and practitioners. And we have selected today an issue which is debt sustainability. That is, of course, at the core of what we do, and independent fiscal institutions do very much. And for that purpose, we are honored to have here two very distinguishing speakers and also the discussant. First, we are going to have a presentation by Professor Enrique Mendoza, extremely well-known macroeconomics researchers with very significant contributions on various fields: financial stability, international economics, and now fiscal sustainability. Professor Mendoza is going to present today a recent paper that he has produced, focusing on the doubts that he has raised about the sustainability of debt in the United States. It's going to act as discussant Carlos Cuerpo. Carlos is Director of Economics of the Division Economic Analysis at AIReF, and has also worked as a researcher in this field. And then after we will have a second session that will be we will be able to listen to Professor Dominique, Professor Dominique from the University of Valencia, but he has also worked in the past as a policymaker, and over the last few years has been the head of macroeconomic research at BBVA Research Department, so has a lot of background on these issues, and also significant contributions on the issue we are going to talk today in the past, and the paper is going to present us today. It's a joint paper with Professor González Páramo, focusing on the sustainability of debt in Spain, and making a number of prescription for the future. The paper will be discussed by Pablo Nadecos, who is the Director General of Economics of the Bank of Spain, but he also, as all the speakers today, has contributions on this issue from his previous research or even recent research on fiscal issues and debt sustainability. So his background, in addition to his background as policymaker, is very suitable to give contrasting and supplementary view to the presentation by Professor Dominique. So I think I will leave it here, and I will give the floor to Professor Mendoza for his presentation.
Oh, thank you, José Luis. Thank you very much. I have to start by making two apologies. So one is, obviously, I should be speaking in Spanish, But unfortunately, my Spanish is so depreciated after so many years of living in the U.S. that for you it would be better that I speak in English, and I won't
must say that
embarrass myself.
Even people following us live from our web probably is worth speaking English.
Yeah, it's better for me too, because then I won't embarrass myself trying to speak in Spanish and not sounding so good. And the second is, of course, I'm in academia, so you're used to speaking standing and pointing to your things. So,
Okay.
but if you allow me, I'll be much comfortable
absolutely,
doing
no,
that.
it's up to you. It's up to you.
So you stop in the half hour, 25 minutes or something.
Okay,
so
we half an hour it's
I don't-
fine, and maybe 15 minutes for the speaker,
10, 15 minutes
for
for
the
the
speaker,
discussion.
and then we have a few minutes for,
Okay,
for
all
the
right,
Q&A
perfect.
session. Okay.
Because they all say talk is cheap, so there is a lot of it. So if you don't stop me, I'll just keep talking. So yes, right. Depending on which perspective you take, I came with good news or I came with bad news. So if you came from the perspective of the region of the world where I come from, this is good news, because finally we're talking about debt crisis somewhere else in the world. And that was also good about the European debt crisis, but but if you come from the perspective of serious economic questions and the perspectives for the relatively near future of the stability of financial and fiscal situations, this is really bad news. And the way I think about these issues and talk to them about them with the students at Penn is at some point there's going to be a collision between the problems that we're having on the fiscal side and the problems we've been having on the financial side. And when that collision happens, it's going to have to do with the role that public debt plays in anchoring financial systems. And okay, so if you look at it from the financial side, you say, well, we have all this need to build a more stable financial systems, and as part of that system, as part of that effort, we have asked financial intermediaries to build buffer stocks of resources, and largely what we say really is that they should position themselves in assets that are relatively risk-free, which turn out to be mostly government obligations of high quality, like the United States Treasury bill. And that is fine for its own sake and its own argument. On the other side, on the other end, when you look at the situation, the fiscal prospects of the issuers of these high quality government debt instruments, the situation that you look at doesn't look so promising. So then it raises a question as to sort of the feedback between the positioning in these risk-free assets and the health of the issuers of those risk-free assets. So this is looking at it from that perspective, saying if you take a look at the United States debt numbers and you start taking a look at it from the traditional ways we normally think about whether the fiscal situation of the United States is sustainable or not, the answer you come up with is pretty pessimistic. And that's why this paper is entitled The Public Debt Crisis of the United States. Now, before someone asks me, because it's a typical question this kind of work stimulates is, well, if things are as bad as I say, how come the prices of these government securities are so high? Or the other side of the same question, how come there is such strong demand for so-called liquid or risk-free assets? How come in some of the countries these government yields are even negative? So I'll come back to that to make that part of the argument as well. But be patient until I get to that. So what debt crisis? So is the first question you might have, right? You look at this title and say, what is this guy talking about? So fine, let's be agnostic, take a statistical definition. And I'm going to borrow on a lot of the work that Henning Bond has done on this issue of developing machinery, statistical tools for testing whether observed debt patterns are consistent with fiscal solvency, so-called debt sustainability tests. In the process of doing that, Henning constructed a data set of the United States net federal debt that goes back to the beginning of the Republic. So with the Assumption Act of 1790 and the creation of the federal debt in the United States. So you take that data set, and it's a very nice data set. It includes the primary deficit, it includes the debt service, it has the two components of the primary balance, and it has the debt. So I'm going to take this statistical definition and say I'm going to define a debt crisis as the 95th percentile of the year-on-year increases in the United States debt ratio. We can debate the definition, but that's the definition I'm going to take. So if you take that definition, you're going to find 5 of these debt crisis episodes in the data that goes back to the beginning of the Republic. And even without me listing them, you will start saying, oh, probably it's World War II, probably it's the Civil War, and you'll be right. And then you might be hesitant, it's probably the current episode, because otherwise this guy wouldn't be talking about this issue here. And then you may be questioning, where does the United States' current debt situation rank relative to these big events that I just mentioned? So it turns out the Great Recession is the second largest by now. Depends second and third how you measure it. The very first one will be World War II, by far the largest expansion of the debt. The second, depending on the definition you take or how much of the current debt projections you take in, could be either the First World War or the Great Recession. And then after that, either the Great Recession or the First World War. After that, the Civil War. And the fifth one is the Great Depression. So the current episode is very large. It's quite unusual situation. So that's, without getting into more structural details as to why it's a crisis, the very least thing that I think everyone will agree to just by looking at the data is quite unusual. It's quite rare to be faced with these high debt ratios in the United States. Moreover, if you look more closely at the data, so I'm going to show you some pictures. What you see right now is a situation of persistent deficits. So you could say, take the year of this debt crisis when they started, and what happened the next 5, 10 years in terms of the primary balance. What you'll find is that in all but the current episodes, by the fourth year, the primary balance was in surplus. It's only in the current episode where you see that the primary balance continues in deficit, and if you buy the projections of the Congressional Budget Office, their baseline projections, we don't change policies, is going to remain in deficits at least through 2026. Now, when it comes to fiscal solvency, it's not sufficient that the deficit becomes smaller. It has become smaller, there's no question of that. But fiscal adjustment does not start, debt reduction does not start until you have actual surpluses. So the sign of the primary balance is critically important. So there are persistent deficits, and these persistent deficits are sharply at odds with the surpluses that have contributed to reverse previous spikes in US debt. So I'm going to show you some pictures that show you the large debt increases, and then the composition of the data that we normally use in this kind of exercise in policy institutions, and decompose for you in the previous episodes how come the debt fell, what were the contributions of the different components of the government balance to reduction in the debt, and why is that different from what we see today. And actually, as bad as it looks, this doesn't look so bad. It looks much worse when you include this issue, which is an issue that permeates many advanced and emerging economies, which are the unfunded liabilities of the entitlement programs. So in the case of the United States, the federal Medicare program and the federal Social Security program have unfunded liabilities to the tune of 93% of gross domestic product. So if the United States were an active client of the IMF will come and say, I don't care about these numbers because these are only the federal. I want the overall debt of the overall government, and I want all the unfunded liabilities. So you have 93% of GDP in unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare at the federal level, and you have another 20% of unfunded liabilities in the states and the municipalities' pension and healthcare plans. So the debt ratio that you see, which is roughly around 80%, the net federal debt ratio, actually by these calculations will be more like 213 or something like that. So it's a lot of debt. The United States has a lot of debt. Now, of course, it's a very large economy with a lot of capacity for raising revenue and so on. Sorry about my phone, it keeps that's the time people are waking up at home, right? So they're going to start getting emails and all kinds of things. So here is the first plot. This is the time series from Henry Bond's paper. The beginning is 1791. The end of his data set is about 2013. So then I spliced it with the data in the CBO projections that I was mentioning to you. So when you see the picture going red, that's where the data is not the Henry Bond data set, because that's where he ended it. But this is what I was saying. If you take as a metric of the fiscal of the debt crisis, the year-on-year increases, the 95 percentile of those are the episodes you see in black. So you see, if you adopt that slightly different, which is to say, let me just find the peaks on this time series. You'll end up with a very similar set of events. The only one you'll miss is this one, which is too bad. Now, this is what I was saying. So by now, this is already a lot of debt. And if things continue the way they're going, it is going to be really pretty similar to the peak that we had in World War II. So it is a lot of debt. And again, these numbers don't include the unfunded liabilities of these entitlement programs. This is what I was discussing earlier. Here is date 0. In each of the events I'll show you, the 2 world wars, the Civil War, the Great Depression, the Great Recession, and what the pattern was as of the year of that event, 10 years forward. So my point earlier is by the 5th year, in all of these events, the primary deficit had turned into a surplus. So when you are in the negative here, you have a primary surplus. When you are there, you have primary deficit. This is the latest observation of the actual data set, and this is the projections from the CBO. So this is the point I was making earlier, that at least through 2026, and by now, the projections are about to come out. It's probably going to be now by 2027, that we're still projecting the US primary balance to be in deficit. So yes, much smaller deficits, no question of that, but much more persistent. And you take the worst episode of all of this is World War II, the reversal into a surplus was quite rapid. So the fiscal adjustment was quite rapid. These are all ratios of GDP, so you may also be wondering, well, there's a component here of growth, and you will be right, so I'll turn to that now. But just looking at the data before getting into any details of metrics and methodologies for what is sustainable or not, it's uncontroversial that the United States is in a pretty unusual debt situation. The debt ratio is the 2nd highest in history. The pattern of fiscal adjustment is something that has not been observed in all these previous episodes. Okay, next observation is, I'm going to do something we used to do in the IMF in the opposite direction. So in the IMF, oops, I do this a lot when I'm in the classroom too, so I even know which button fixes. So, oops, press it. It's slow, so you press it and you wait. Yeah, and then sometimes it does it. There you go. So now someone's doing this. Okay, thanks. so that's why if 2 people are trying to do the same thing, that's what happens. Anyways, so what we normally will do is try to account for the way a country got into debt. So we will grab the government account and say if the debt went from this point to this point, how much of it was the overall deficit, how much was it lack of growth, how much it was the primary balance, things like that. Just decompositions with accounting identities. So I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do it in the reverse. When you look at this peak and then you reach this trough, how long did it take? And how much of the change had to do with the change in the primary balance versus change in the debt service versus a change in the growth rate? So all of these things are ratios of output. So if output is growing, the ratio is falling. Okay? So growth is good for debt ratios, obviously. So I'm going to do that in here. So those are the episodes I was telling you from peak to trough. Okay, so these are not the fiscal crisis. Now it's going through the series I show you, find the peaks, and then the trough. So some are periods relatively short. This is 1792 to 1812. Some are very large. So coming down from the very large debt at the end of World War II, took from 1946 to 1974. This column is the initial debt ratio in the first year. This column is the final one in the last year. And then I'm going to show you the difference. So this is how much the debt ratio changed in each of these. So now what I'm doing here that I put in this rectangle is, this is the basic government accounting. It says the change in the debt ratio, here say between 1812 and 1792, by accounting definition is equal to the overall government deficit, and then some term we call the growth dividend. The growth dividend is made out of the growth rate, where gamma is the real growth rate of the economy, divided over 1 plus gamma, multiplied by the initial debt. So you can see how much the growth component was. So you can see, for instance, in this episode, the debt ratio fell 30 percentage points. Out of that, 7 was the overall deficit. So that means a negative means it was an overall surplus. So in this case, a surplus of 7.2% cumulative over this entire time period contributed to this decline of 30% in the debt ratio. and the rest was the growth effect. So if you look at things this way, and you look at the numbers here, you will conclude two things. You may be tempted to conclude that growth is the whole story, because everywhere here you see these large negative numbers, and they're all due to growth. With regard to the overall deficit, in 2 episodes you had surpluses, but in the other 3, which are the more recent ones, you actually had deficits. So this one from the World War II, actually you had a cumulative deficit of 18.5. So this episode alone will tell you the whole thing is really growth. That's how we really brought the debt down. The downside of that is that those projections of where growth is going in the US are not that glossy, so if that's what you will expect to happen, even there you will have a problem. I'll show you in a minute the average growth rate over this period. And this is what these numbers will turn out if instead of doing cumulatives, you do the per year averages. So you can see that in this case, you have a per year overall deficit of 0.7% of GDP. So that was non-trivial. So again, if you look at the picture this way, you tend to say, oh, it's all growth. So all we need is a good dose of sustained period of growth and problem solved. Well, but we know by accounting that this is the primary balance plus debt service. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to redo the exercise, doing that decomposition. And then I'm going to get this. It's going to go, again, this 30% will be 25% primary deficit, surplus actually, because it's negative. So 25% was a cumulative primary surplus. And then 5% will be the growth effect minus the debt service. So when you look at this way, you say, again, yeah, growth was very important, particularly for eating away at the debt service. In fact, it paid for the debt service and then some. But it is not true that fiscal adjustment did not matter. In all of these episodes, there were cumulative primary surpluses. And some of them are quite large, and particularly in this episode of the largest reduction in debt, they were quite important. You had primary surpluses to the tune of 1% of GDP per year. Okay? So, all previous episodes of reductions of very high debt in the United States have been the result of non-trivial contributions of primary balances in surplus. My point from earlier, adjustment doesn't start until those numbers I show you that were deficits turn into surpluses. They need to change sign before we even start talking about fiscal adjustment. And here is what I was saying. In this period where the growth contributed a lot, the annual growth rate in the US economy was 3.5%. So much higher than things we expect to see, at least in the near future. Okay, so this is what fiscal expansionists will say. So even if I give you these numbers, you know, all this stuff that I have shown you so far in these previous slides, they will say, well, you should not worry about any of these. In fact, we want 3 reasons why we shouldn't be worried about this at all. We need fiscal expansion. They talk less and less. You know, things are going, at least quote unquote, so well in the US real economy these days that they don't talk so much about this anymore. We were just talking about this a lot. You got asked this question a couple of years ago, maybe 18 months ago, they would have still said this. You want to have the fiscal multiplier. You want to finance fiscal expansions because you want to fight your way out of this secular stagnation problem. They would also say what I was beginning to suggest earlier, there is such a strong demand worldwide for these safe assets. We need them, the banks need them, the financial system needs them, the private sector needs them. So we need to have more of this, and the way to have more debt is to spend more. So we should have larger deficits. And also what I was suggesting earlier, the price of the debt is so high, it's a good time to borrow. So why don't we borrow yet to finance these expansionary fiscal policies, even more appealing when it's cheap? So there will be these 3 arguments for saying, don't worry about the debt, actually we need to spend more. Not only don't worry that it's so high, make it even higher. So I'm going to make an arguments that go against this. And I probably will run out of time, so I'll give you all 4 and then try to elaborate on the ones I have time to elaborate. So first, there's empirical evidence. It turns out that the fiscal multipliers are actually negative in countries that have high debt. It's not just that they're not significantly positive, and we can have a debate of whether it should be 0.1 or 0.5 or 1. It's actually that they're negative, that the need to actually service the debt implies that the cumulative effect on the economy or the increase in debt is negative. Then I'll use some of these tests that herringbone design for measuring debt sustainability, and I'll show you that there is a very sharp, significant structural break in the fiscal reaction function of the United States. It still passes the solvency test, so if all you wanted to worry is whether the fiscal solvency condition holds, you can go home self-assured. But it's holding with a debt ratio that points to becoming something like 250% over the long run. So if you get awakened at night by that number, even though it satisfies the solvency condition, then you should wake up at night. Then we'll say, okay, so this is what the empirical analysis on its own can do. You don't need a model if you wanted to choose between spending more or not. So do you like 200% debt, or do you prefer to go back to 40% debt? For that, I need a more structured model. So I'm going to give you some results that come out of a neoclassical model where you bring in taxes and debt, and then you ask the question, the debt went up this much. I have to raise taxes or reduce expenditures to match that. What is a good way of doing it, or what is a bad way of doing it, or can I even do it? So it's a discussion, if you want, about Laffer curves, but in the context of these dynamic neoclassical models, it will be a discussion about dynamic Laffer curves. So there's a work that, for example, for the context of the European crisis, Travan and Jülich did, and I'll show you some of the implications related to that. Then there's this issue about why the prices of the securities are so high, and I'm going to argue that that situation is more a sign of instability than a sign of stability. I'm going to argue that the strong global demand for United States government debt could be a transitory result from the financial globalization process, and it could be a result of that because of two reasons. Because countries that became financially globalized are financially heterogeneous. So domestically, the credit markets of China and the credit markets of the US are at a very different stage of development. And what you can find from prediction of theory is that when you integrate capital markets with those heterogeneous systems to the inside, you should expect the equilibrium outcome to be that the more financially developed system becomes a very large net debtor. So it's almost like the opposite of traditional macro, where you would have thought that the emerging markets should become the debtors. In this story that I'm telling you, it will happen the opposite. So there will be this slow-moving but temporary phenomenon of rising demand for these assets until the process of dynamics converges, and then it stops. Another reason, again, from financial globalization is even if countries are financially homogeneous, so they have the same financial conditions, financial integration across countries with heterogeneous financing needs for the government will lead to a similar phenomenon in which those that have, if you want, more fiscal space, to use the lingo of the day, will end up becoming large debtors to those that have less fiscal space. Oh, and then there's also an issue here about the possibility of self-fulfilling expectations. It may be that the global demand becomes even higher when people perceive volatility to be higher. Even if it isn't turned out to be higher, just they have the belief that it could be higher. That could drive the demand higher, and it could make the prices of the securities even higher. But as some of the recent research, like some of the work by Marcus Munez-Meyer suggests, that those episodes where these yields are really low also generate financial instability. Then you may have a self-fulfilling crisis in which people believe that things could be highly volatile. They demand a lot of these risk-free assets because that drives the price too high. It creates instability, which generates outcomes that justify the beliefs that the demanders of the debt have. So you can have a classic kind of case of self-fulfilling expectation. The full model of that is not something that people have done yet, but it's a conjecture that sort of works on what I have here. Then the final thing, which I'm surely not going to have time to talk about, is given how bleak these three things look like, then you may want to question whether the commitment to repay the debt that is implicit on these debt contracts that we typically assume to be risk-free is really there. So in the case of public debt, we know traditionally, well, public debt is a nominal instrument, and we have in the literature for a long time talked about inflation as a partial way of de facto defaulting. So normally we use a more discrete language, and we say debasing or liquefying the debt, right? We don't say default, but it is what it is. It is default. It's just not a contractual default. It is reducing the real burden of what the government is paying. But in the data, if you go historically, this is from the work of Reinhardt and Rogoff back to 1750, you do have episodes, they're very rare, but you do have episodes in which governments default outright on the domestic holders of debt. this very nice paper in the United States, again by the same period of just in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, of a United States default on its domestic debt obligation. And it's a very interesting article by Hall and Sargent. It's a historical description and some interpretation of how and why that happened. It's not really a full-blown model. But what can work on that, and that's some of the work that Pablo de Erasmo and I have been doing more recently, is to thinking, when you have to think about a situation where the holders of the debt are your constituency, it's a very different world as the Argentina or Mexico external default. In those worlds, you typically think about the country defaults on some external lender. The external lender is some guy that lives outside of the sphere of interest of the sovereign. So it's not part of the payoff function of the sovereign. So Mexico defaults on the banks in New York in the 80s, and Mexico says too bad. The banks say too bad, because while the dance was good, they collected very high excess returns, and that was fine for both sides. In domestic defaults, that's not going to work, because potentially the constituency of the holders of the debt is part of the constituency of the government. So it really is more about redistribution. When the government chooses to default outright, it's redistributing between those that have debt and those that have no debt. Inflation is a little bit like that too, in that sense. It's just more partial than complete. So if you want to try to think about these domestic defaults, Carmen and Ken call this paper of theirs that they documented this evidence, the forgotten history of domestic debt, because they said, look, there is stuff in history. The frequency is much smaller, so there is 3 external defaults for each one of the domestic defaults. So the ratio is about 1 to 3, and the external defaults have a frequency of about 5 to 6% in the long run. So you're talking really infrequent events, but they do happen. And they have happened in all kinds of places, including advanced economies. So we try to explain that. We try to say, okay, if you have this heterogeneity where some guys hold the debt, some guys don't hold the debt, it may be optimal if the ownership of the debt becomes sufficiently concentrated for a sovereign that cares about all of them to choose to default, rather than to impose the taxation that is needed to continue to service the debt. It's not obvious, and it requires a little bit more doing than I will have time, but you can actually get to a situation like that. Now, of course, if that was the full story, you will never have debt markets, right? Because if you know the government cares about everybody, at some point it issues debt today, then we give him stuff, those of us that save, and then the next period the government would say, oh, too bad, I'm always going to have less inequality if I default. So that cannot be the whole story. There has to be a countervailing force that the government thinks is the social cost of actually defaulting. Otherwise, it just looks like it's a good idea to default. And this is where the role of public debt in financial markets becomes the key ingredient. Public debt is the instrument that provides liquidity to financial systems, is the instrument that private entities, financial and non-financial, use for the buffer stocks of what we call also self-insurance. It's an instrument that provides for risk-sharing vehicles that may be absent at the social level, at the national level in the economies. These 3 things, you can do also exercises to quantify them in macroeconomic models, calibrated to country data. The social value there is very high, which is why defaults that are domestic in nature are very rare, because you can't counterbalance this very high social value of retaining those instruments at play against the potential benefit of doing this regressive redistribution versus progressive redistribution. Okay. So that's a nice story. It requires a lot more than the time that I have, so I'm not going to get to it. So right away I'm telling you. I have a couple of papers with Pablo de Erasmo. I would want to say this. We partly thought about this problem because of the historical data, but we also thought about this because, from our perspective, several aspects of the European debt crisis look more as a domestic default than as external default. Okay, Europe is not a fiscal union, so it's not a single country, and in our model it's as if the country is a single country. Fine, so that is a caveat, and it's an important one. But in Europe, the vast majority of the debt that is issued by European sovereigns stays within Europe. In Europe, countries cannot individually use inflation to debase their own debt. And in Europe, when we had the debt crisis, what you saw was a concern from the European-wide institutions like the Eurozone, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, a concern for the redistribution that a potential default by one or more of the players will cause. And that's really the key in which it resembles our story. That is the concern for this trade-off between redistribution and the value of having the debt instrument that was driving the decisions. So that's partly, and so some of the exercises we have were calibrated for the European Union. One of them was calibrated to the Spanish data, actually. Okay, anyway, so how am I doing with time? So I know I don't.
25 minutes.
Okay, so I'm almost out of time. This is not too bad. Actually, this is really bad. So let me just tell you some numbers. So for the multipliers, basically, if you look at the paper that we did with Itan Ilselsky, essentially what we found is that you take country data, industrial and advanced economies, and you do the standard analysis with VAR identification for the effects of government expenditures on the real economy. There's a collection of results there. In some you have negative multipliers, in some you have positive multipliers, in some the multiplier is statistically significant, in some it's not. But what comes uniformly as a strong result is that when debt ratios surpass certain averages, the multiplier is negative. And that's the result that I've been pushing. That if the debt exceeds 60%, the expenditure multiplier is actually zero in impact, and it's quite a big negative in the long run. So this is also an argument that in my previous incarnation, some of the group of people that argue for higher debt actually had used to argue in favor of something that was called expansionary austerity. That because of these kinds of things, if you actually increase taxes, you may actually trigger expansions, because then the agents in the economy will expect that the expectations on solvency improve, so you create expectations that taxes in the future will be lower. And that you can work out in models as well. Okay, so fiscal reaction functions. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to talk very quickly about this. So essentially, what we had from Henning Bond was the notion that if you run a regression from the primary balance on the initial debt and other controls, like the output gap and government expenditures and other things, if this coefficient is positive, it basically implies that the fiscal solvency condition holds. It implies that the present discounted value of the primary balance equals the initial debt. Or in the lingo of institutions of these days, that the debt is sustained. So it's a sufficiency condition. It's not even the necessary one, but it's a sufficient one. And then he ran these regressions in a collection of papers. So here I just want to quickly show you that we redid these regressions in our work. This is for a chapter of the Handbook of Macro with Jing Sang and Pablo de Erasmo again. If you use the same sample period of the bond regression, we get the exact same result that Henning got for this coefficient. If you rerun the regression adding 5 years more than Henning had just to the year of the crisis, you still get the same coefficient. If you add the data to 2014, the response coefficient drops. Now these are kind of like autocorrelation coefficients. So this world with 0.10 is a very different world to this world with 0.08. Let me show you just in a graphic how quickly, and then I'll be finished. So I'm going to show you what it implies for the long-run dynamics of the debt. Okay, this is remember, this is a relationship of how much the primary balance responds when the debt increases. So almost by construction, but it doesn't respond with a larger primary balance. It's going to respond with more debt. So implicit in this is a dynamic equation for the evolution of the debt. I'm going to use that. Okay, so this is, first of all, taking this fiscal reaction function, the estimated one, the one I'm showing you here, and asking the question, where should the primary balance be? What this is telling me is that up to here, and Bond had also done structural tests at various periods, up to this point, the United States had been very resilient. Okay, this data set, you have World War I, World War II, the Civil War, the Great Depression, 0.1, more or less, 0.1. Right now, you get 0.07, 0.08. You can do standard tests to verify that this is indeed a statistically significant break. So the chart I'm going to show you is, if we had stayed with this fiscal reaction function, what should have been the pattern of the primary balance in the US? How does it differ from the observed pattern of the primary balance? So this is that. The black line is the observed primary balance up to here, and from then on is the projections from the president's budget. And then the regression that ends in 2008 will give you this projected path for the primary balance. And these are the two standard error bands for the projection. So you can see these deficits from 2009 to about 2015 are much larger than what this regression can credibly predict, even within the two standard error bands. They're excessive. And it's consistent with what I told you in the previous picture. That's why the pattern of fiscal adjustment is lagging behind so much. And then the last one here I'll show you is what does it imply that we have had this change from 0.10 to 0.07, actually a little less than 0.07 in this actual picture, for the adjustment of the debt. Okay? So given that we have had this structural change in the fiscal reaction function, that has implied the structural change of how the deficit is behaving, because we have much larger deficits than we have, it's natural to imagine we're going to end up with higher debt. And this is just saying, yes, if you take that fiscal reaction function with the actual one, the debt ratio over a very long period, okay, so what we're saying is that it will take until the year, I guess it's 3,000, or no, actually 2100, the year 2100 for the debt ratio to go back to its original average. But if you do take the structural break as a given, that's going to stay there at 0.07, then the debt ratio is actually going to stay at a much higher level. It's going to increase in this calculation by about 35 percentage points of GDP forever. That's the new high level of the debt ratio. Okay, I'm out of time, so I shouldn't bore you with the rest of this stuff. Let me just show you one quick picture, and then I'll be quiet. So another thing that we did was to calculate the implications. So if we try to say in a structured macro model, how much will it take to make the debts that we see sustainable? So in the United States, the debt went up in the Great Recession by about a third of GDP. In the weighted largest 15 economies of the EU, it went by 20% of GDP. So take a two-country, fairly neoclassical model, except we constructed to capture the observed estimates of the elasticity of tax bases from the microdata. So take a model of that kind. It's a dynamic general equilibrium model. So everything that goes into the government budget constraint, tax rates, factor prices, not the tax rate, tax revenues, factor prices, decisions to labor, to accumulate capital, interest rates, all the present quantities are endogenous. That determines tax revenue. That determines the present value of the tax revenue. So ask the question, how much does the present value of the primary balance change as I change the tax rates? So this is what we call a dynamic Laffer curve. This is the current tax rate in the case of the United States. This is the value of the capital tax rate. This is how much the sustainable debt can change. This is how much the present discounted value along the equilibrium path of the economy can change. How much more debt can you actually sustain? And the baseline, since it's a difference, right, so the delta of it in the baseline by construction is 0. That's where we are today at the current tax rate. You're not in, is the current steady state, so nothing's changing. This is telling you as you increase the tax rate, if the US is an open economy, this is how much the sustainable debt can rise. The red one. And if it's a closed economy, is the blue one. And that's because there are adverse tax externalities. If the US increases tax, then it's going to lose competitive advantage in taxation relative to Europe, and that's going to create leakage in revenues, which is going to imply that as a closed economy, you will get more than as an open economy. But the important thing here is that what you need, which will be for this 31% increase in the debt, is way higher than the maximum of both of these curves. So this dynamic Laffer curve is telling you, with capital taxation, you cannot make those debts sustainable. You may need other instruments, and those instruments may actually work. The labor tax could work in the US, but the capital tax is not going to do it. So that's where I leave you. Sorry, because I've been over time. But, yeah, that's a picture for you. Sorry.
Well, while they change the slides, I would just want to thank again Professor Mendoza for being here today. I must apologize first because I'm in a dire position, as in the morning I'm following his course at Temfi, and in the afternoon I have to come here and then discuss and criticize his work. So have incentives to be very soft this afternoon. So I'll try and be orthogonal instead of soft, and add several arguments following our own research on what Professor Mendoza just said. I don't have you have the pointer?
It's over there. Sorry.
So first on motivation, I went back to their picture in the research, and added a couple of more sources of information. Basically, according to the IMF long-term database, and also to the database that we developed with Professor Comín on the Spanish series, filling some gaps, for example, for the Spanish Civil War, etc. We see that basically this is not just a U.S. thing. What Mendoza identifies as 4 debt crisis episodes for the U.S. since the 20th century, with only one of them, of course, in the last 70 years, the current one. This appears to be mostly a shared picture with the G20 countries, which is this gray area representing the 30th to 70th percentile of gross government debt to GDP for the G20 countries, both developed and developing. And this picture is also concerning, particularly for the US and for Spain, as we see in the dotted and the red line. So basically, adding to this stock picture, Mendoza was qualifying it with additional factors, such as the scarce primary balance reaction in this latest episode, in order to provide some justification around his mostly canonical view on the fact that there might be, or we should be concerned somehow about the sustainability of the U.S. public debt. And I would add also, why not, about other countries. So basically, is it this time really different or not? And if it's different, is it actually for the better? Basically, this is just a summary of the paper. Unfortunately, he didn't have time to go through the whole material, because it's actually a very encompassing paper, and it covers a lot of his past research. But it's just to follow through in one slide the different arguments. So in green you would have arguments in favor of a less canonical approach, so a more expansionary approach, accepting higher levels of debt, and then the corresponding qualifiers coming from his research. Basically, you will see that I will focus the presentation on issues related to the estimation of the fiscal reaction function, and also on the definition or the importance, which is a key aspect for us, of the institutional aspects related to sustainability of public debt, and to how much debt a country can take depending on its institutional setup. Basically, here, for the sake of saving some time, I won't go through all the arguments. I would like to point out, also to open the discussion for later on, some of the more recent research coming, for example, from the ECB, from authors like Godic and Perotti earlier this year, on the additional factors for safe assets. So they identify somehow not only liquidity or money demand factors, but also some sort of safety premium, which is on top of. So this would argue in favor of making this temporary phenomenon a little bit long-lasting. And they basically identify that the demand for safe assets is structural. There is a rather stable throughout the last century demand for safe assets, and this is rather there to stay. So this would be somehow saying that the financial markets cover up for any gaps in government bonds as safe assets, and then you have a development of private safe assets, which in a sense end up not being that safe, and somehow also determinants of the credit cycles. So it's a rather interesting argument that might add to the discussion. In terms also of the implicit assumption that all the models make about the repayment commitment by governments, in a sense, as you said, history is full with examples of serial defaulters, not only in emerging markets, but also in developed economies. And you pointed to the distribution of incentives. Here is just a point which might be relevant for us also in terms of the institutional setup of the EU and also of the Spanish case. In general, you could take this with the view of repeated games. So if the government is engaged in infinitely repeated games, the incentives for default also diminish somehow. So what would lead the government out of this equilibrium, for example, the fact that he doesn't have an infinite horizon, which is also institutionally related to how strong the institutions in a country are. And on the other hand, if you have subnationals, for example, or you have supranational entity that might be either implicitly or explicitly bailing out a region, you also have reduced incentives for keeping your implicit commitment about repayment, which might be two arguments institutionally important for Spain as well. So let me highlight, first say that mostly I think we would all agree, at least broadly or in general, with your view and with your argument. So I would just like to point out two specific, let's say, bits of analysis that we've done here and that could add to the picture and somehow qualify it. The first one has to do with the empirical approach and the estimation of the fiscal reaction functions. We observe, and you see one in your data, some sort of structural breaks in the estimates of this coefficient. So our next step was actually to just look at the possibility that this coefficient was time varying. And there is actually evidence, at least for Spain, very clear that the reaction of the government of the primary balance is time varying respect, so it's not constant with respect to the level of debt. And I'll show you a picture right now. And so this qualifies a bit the argument related to the fact that public debt management right now might be very different than what it was before, at least for Spain. And then on the default factors, I would like to point out the importance of institutional features like the strength of the fiscal rules for the case of the existence of these default episodes. So in terms of the solvency condition, I won't go through the details, but basically we said that intertemporal budget constraint, the IBC, could be summarized by the fact that these beta in the fiscal reaction function is actually larger than 0. So you have a primary balance that is responding to the level of debt, and it could be responding to other factors such as inertia or output gap, expenditure gaps, etc., as you said. And there's a lot of research on these estimates. But actually, we talk about this beta 0 as a necessary or sufficient condition. I would explain now why we can say necessary instead of sufficient, or we can call about the need for a augmented sufficient condition, in this case for the sustainability concept. Because if you just plug in this primary balance, this fiscal reaction function, into a simplified debt accumulation equation, which is the one which I call 1 prime, which is basically debt changes depending on the primary balance and the interest rate growth gap, you end up actually having an equation like equation 4, where the sustainability condition is what I call the sufficient condition, or an augmented sufficient condition with respect to your beta greater than 0, whereby the primary balance reaction, that is this beta coefficient, this beta estimate, has to be not only greater than 0, but it has to be big enough in order to compensate for the interest rate growth differential. And this might be just it's a small qualifier, but it ends up actually being very important when you also add this time varying dimension. Why? Let's have a look at our time varying results for the Spanish case. So basically here I plotted the beta coefficient for Spain. since 1850 until 2016. So you see in this graph that for most of the period the beta is positive, and you have some periods whereby the beta was almost close to 2.01. So you could, if we only stick to this definition of solvency, of the intertemporal and budget constraint being met, we could talk about various periods in which the public debt management was actually something solid and responsible, taking into account solvency. However, if we add this enhanced sufficient condition, whereby this beta has to be big enough in order to cover for the interest rate load, so to speak, we will see that basically this was not responding, these increases in the primary balance was not responding so much to a solvency feature of the debt dynamics, but rather to some liquidity issues that the Spanish Treasury was actually having. So here is a very different picture than the one before. Why? Because we add this sustainability condition, and it's going to be just a binary. It's either met or not met. If it's 1, in that specific year, beta was big enough in order to compensate for the interest rate growth differential, and if it's -1, it was not. So what we saw before, that were many periods where we could think of the primary balance reaction being big enough, and therefore the response of the government being responsible, we see that it was just a very erratic debt management until basically second half of the past century, first with some financial repression, but then with the beginning of the 80s and the beginning of the welfare state in Spain, was still a very responsible public debt management policy. And this you can actually qualify this figure of the specific beta by looking at how much you took into account also this interest rate factor, which is again related to what you said on what can we expect forward in terms of temporary changes in interest rates or not. And my final point will be on the defaults. So basically, usually what the literature tells us is that what matters is your past record. If you've been very good at not producing any defaults or outright restructuring your debt, then markets believe you, and you have very good financing conditions, etc. So basically, that's the key point. But we have recent research, specifically from Norambuena in 2015, where we identify new factors such as the role of institutions. So it's not only a matter of how well you did in the past, but how you corrected for those potential issues that you had by creating strong and competent and reliable and independent institutions. So basically, what we did was extend this work in Norambuena with a unbalanced panel with 96 countries, macro fiscal variables from 1850 to 2015, which is based on basically an updated version of the IMF's fiscal rule database. And we constructed the fiscal rule index because, I mean, you can understand why we do that, being where we are. We want to somehow, or to some extent, being able to quantify the impact of changes in the legislation, such as the ones that occurred, for example, in Spain after 2012, with the strengthening of the fiscal rules set up. So basically, these indicators is some sort of composite indicators summarizing the strength, the number of fiscal rules, their coverage, and the degree of legal enforcement. We defined the debt spike events in a very similar way than what you did. So it's basically an increase of debt. So the change, the annual change in debt, instead of above the 95th percentile, as we include some emerging markets, we took the 90th percentile in order to have more events to test against, and use those for the identification of unsustainable debt dynamic periods. So what's the result? we were happy with the results, basically, because what we find is that strong fiscal rules actually help reduce the likelihood of large debt spikes. Then you can ask, of course, okay, by how much? Is it significant in quantitative terms? So the whole effort in strengthening our benchmark, our fiscal benchmark, is it actually worth it? And the response is actually quite telling, because basically we have that the probability of having or witnessing one of these events of debt increases above the 90th percentile of the whole distribution decreases more than 10% when you actually go from no set of rules or weak fiscal rules to the full setup being in place, from 0 to 1 in the National Fiscal Rules Index. So this allows us actually somehow to evaluate the impact of the different steps in the construction of the EU benchmarks and fiscal rules, and also fiscal institutions, of course, as part of the whole benchmark. So basically, improving the fiscal framework can actually also be a good antidote to compensate for a history of past default. And this is an additional argument that could lead towards qualifying this canonical view of potential dangers in terms of sustainability, especially for the case of Spain. And that's where I will start, and we can open the...
You want to react?
I just quick make one point.
Please.
Yes, it's too bad you missed the class this morning, because I actually went through this point several times. So, okay. So here is a perverse thing. It is one thing to test solvency condition is about whether the present value constraint of the government holds. So the interesting thing is, if that's all you care, the necessary condition, actually, which is what I was telling the class this morning, is something like this. What you need is either the public debt, and for the guys of you here that work on time series econometrics, this is going to make you happy. The necessary condition is the primary balance and the debt are integrated time series of any finite order. What it means is that if you take the debt series and you difference it once, and it becomes stationary, then the solvency condition holds. If you had to difference it twice, and it becomes stationary, the solvency condition holds. And then the answer to that is, it's always going to hold in historical data. Why? Because we don't know of any macro time series that is not stationary after you difference it actually once. So what Hennebaum shows in a 2007 paper, it's a theoretical paper, that is essentially a derivation that says, look, what I gave you in my fiscal reaction function was was a sufficient condition. The necessary one is even weaker. And it's so weak that you can't have much hope to reject it. So that's the spin you have to put on that is testing for solvency by itself on historical data is not a very useful exercise. You should start by the premise that you cannot reject it. What he recommends, and I was telling the class very honestly in the morning, is a positive and a negative spin on this. Why is it perverse? Because what it means is exactly what you identified, which is good that you found it on your own, is there is this range in which this coefficient is not big enough. And guess what happens in that range? The fiscal solvency condition holds, but the debt grows to infinity. It just doesn't grow fast enough, right? Because you're discounting. So you're taking the discounted value of the debt of the infinite future at some power of infinity on the denominator. So if the denominator is growing faster than the numerator, boom, the solvency condition holds. And in mathematics, we know that polynomial growth is dominated by exponential growth. And this is exactly what happens. So it's a very perverse case. When I was at the IMF, we were working on these papers. I was explaining this, and man, it was heated discussions, people leaving the room and so on, because I'm going like, no, you know, if all you care about this, you can have countries where the debt is going to infinity, and you cannot reject the hypothesis that the solvency condition holds. So this is part of what I spend. I mean, I'm not trying to defend that as the real world. I'm saying in the arithmetic, so just testing for solvency, you end up with these perverse situations where the moral of where the literature is on this right now is just testing, just determining whether an observed debt is consistent with the solvency condition isn't all that interesting. And that's why we move forward and we say, what if I, and the point of the time varyingness is very important. And that's kind of the thing that Henning also recommends these days, and I fully agree with it. It's much more valuable to look at what these fiscal reaction functions may look like, what their empirical characteristics are, and what lessons we draw from that. And these time varying things are very important. What he found in the context of the US wasn't so much the time varyingness, but he found these splines. So he found when the US debt ratio goes above 45%, it's actually a higher coefficient. So he introduced these splines in his regression. He did various of these time varying tests. What he found is that the ones that were significant and robust were these splines. But what this says is that this current episode is even worse, because traditionally what would have happened when the US debt is high is that this coefficient of response should be even higher. And what we found is that it's gone down. So I think it's exactly, you're on the right track in the sense of looking for the role of institutions, for the role of these time varying responses. But the stuff about this response coefficient being higher or lower than the number, I wouldn't worry so much about that. I would worry more about the message that you learn from looking at the features of these time varying adjustments and the role of issues like the features of the institutions. I think that's very valuable, and I think it's a very important part of the analysis. Yeah, just leave you with a message. Just testing for solvency by determining whether the government budget constraint holds. Turns out we wasted a lot of time and a lot of papers among the ones you cited, which turned out to be, and this is not just my opinion. At this point, I was telling the class, you pick up the textbooks. The Lundquist-Sargent macro textbook has a chapter that deals with this, and essentially Sargent tells you very honestly, this guy knocked out a lot of empirical papers, which include the ones you mentioned, and include a bunch of Sargent himself wrote. So he was very honest, kind of saying, basically, we didn't have this specified. Right? So, anyways,
shall we open a round of comments from the audience?
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. Just to give it, I don't know, after, from your presentation, it's clear that we get that the public debt is high by historical records in the US. The US government has become a bit lazy in the sense that they are not reacting as they used to react to debt. But what's not clear, I mean, in terms of implications of your talk is that, of course, on the one hand, I mean, let's say you have the expansionary guys, I mean, as you were mentioning, so they want to keep on pursuing. But at the same time, I mean, from your talk, it's not clear, I mean, what to do ahead now. No, so we haven't seen in the previous spikes, let's say, any defaults or anything like that. So maybe someone could say, okay, we just wait, until something happens. So in terms of where to go, how to go there, I mean, what would you advise in this situation? Because it's not clear from beyond the story about the capital taxes and so on. It's not clear to me where to go. No?
Yeah, I sort of run out of time. In the case, the United States has two things that make him unique also. One of them is good for them because it's the story about the exorbitant privilege. So because everybody else holds that debt, a little inflation, a little depreciation of the dollar, all these things help the fiscal burden of the United States. So in a way, they have instruments that are unique to it in the sense of the capacity to distribute the burden of fiscal adjustment worldwide. On top of the general equilibrium effects that means for everybody else's macroeconomy. But just a little depreciation and a little inflation to them is something that, I'm not saying that strategically is what they will do. I'm saying that you don't necessarily need to see one day that the US government says we're defaulting. It just might be that the equilibrium outcome is just like it was in the 70s with the gold standard, that things start moving in one direction and then they keep moving in that direction, and before you know it, the dollar has depreciated by enough to help the fiscal accounts of the United States quite a bit. Could be. The other thing is you can have things that when you see where the problems where they are, so the problem of Social Security, you don't have to go and say, I'm not going to pay you. You can do stuff like, I'm going to increase the retirement age 3 years. Apparently, by some accounts, something between 3 and 5 will fix the hole in the Social Security. Is that a default? I think it kind of is, but it's not the kind of thing that you're going to read in the newspapers like a mass. It's going to look like a pension reform, and everybody's going to have to negotiate on that. So I'm not saying that there will be a day of doom and reckoning, but what I'm saying is there will be a combination of these things. So government budget constraints end up holding because they're like checking account identities. So something's going to fill the hole. We have record in the past. This is the Holt and Sargent moral of the story, where you say, well, in that episode, the U.S. line up its creditors and they say, you guys, I'm going to give you a new coupon with another 30 years, and you're going to earn this lower rate on it. You guys, I'm going to give you a coupon that doesn't even pay until 20 years from now. And so it literally went through the 5 groups of creditors and restructured their debts unilaterally. I don't think that's going to happen, but there are several mechanisms to kind of resolve the fiscal situation. The question I was trying to point out at the end is that we need to ask which ones are good ones, which ones are orderly ones, and which ones are disorderly ones. In the case of the U.S., if you take that model where it came from the Laffer curves, you look at the labor side of the U.S., is the second thing that the U.S. has good, is that it has room for taxation on labor. Why? Because its labor tax rates are low, and its consumption tax rates at the federal level are non-existent. So unlike most regions in Europe, it has the capacity to generate efficient tax revenue from the labor side. And if you had done the same exercise I showed you, but for the labor tax, you could find a value of the labor tax rate that can bring the Laffer curve to cut the necessary debt increase. So that, if you wanted to fix the U.S. debt problem with a traditional fiscal approach, there is a space to do it with taxation. Do I think politically that's going to happen in the United States? Absolutely. In the current climate, absolutely not. They're about to agree to reduce the tax rates. No one is going to agree to increase anything. And, that's how it looks today, unfortunately.
I have a question from someone who is watching us from the streaming. It's from Jose Fernandez. It's to you and Enrique. I will. Have you ever considered the role of stock flow adjustments in your analysis? Mulas, Granados et al. From the IMF present evidence that their impact in large debt spike is not negligible. Moreover, there are periods in which primary balances or growth are not the main drivers of debt ratios. What's your view on that?
Maybe I need more ingredients on the question as to what they mean by stock flows and what they mean by not being primary balance of growth, because what I did was an accounting identity, right? So the debt equals the primary balance plus the debt service plus the growth component. So in other countries you have had additions, you have defaults, you have other, if you had adjustments or restructuring of the debt, yes, it's something we used to do a lot on the IMF. Is countries that have debt restructuring, there are other contributions to the debt adjustment. But on the standard one, which is what I was applying for the US, again, not assuming that there will be a restructuring, certainly arithmetically, you can only allocate it to those 3 things. In emerging markets, for example, you may also have windfall revenues from like privatization from enterprises. So then you have other terms you can bring in there. But the more canonical calculation is just coming off the accounting identity. Stock flow, so the kind of stock flows that I know is adjustments like the ones we see in emerging markets also, because real exchange rate valuation, since again, public debt is a nominal instrument. So when the real exchange rate strengthens or weakens, in emerging markets, the ratios can actually change a lot. So you saw this happening in Argentina, for example. So those kinds of valuation effects, if that's what we mean, those can matter a lot. Now, in the case of the United States, because the debt is all in dollars, it's essentially the composition that I made. If the United States was placing foreign currency debt abroad, then you could have role, in addition to what I showed you, for valuation effects. So you do these calculations for other countries that do issue internationally, then you have other valuation effects or stock flow adjustments that you could add. But in the case of the US, it's very plain vanilla in that way.
But I guess the issue is that whether privatizations, for example, in the US data are incorporated into revenues?
No, I was just suggesting for things that the question may be thinking of as additions that were not present in my accounting identity. When we do these kind of calculations in the emerging markets, sometimes we can have additional temporary revenues that the government obtained because it privatized an airline company, which in the case of the United States are not relevant. Yeah. So that's very simple.
Yes, Manolo.
Does the source of debt matter Because obviously in the previous episodes before the Great Recession, what you had is debt that was mainly because of investment purposes, while in this case it was just a transfer from the public to the private sector, in a sense a bailout of private debt with public debt. So in that context, obviously you're generating much less growth, and that's part of your identity that is not going to be able to generate, let's say, the right dynamics in order to correct it.
Yes. So the answer to that is probably yes. It is not explicitly in any of the structures that I was showing you. You look historically, it's right that you look at episodes of World War II, the increase in the debt was very sharp, and it was very clearly why. And it was essentially to finance the war effort. Now, to the extent that you look in the future, once you start reconstruction, capital stocks are very low, but growth rates are very high. So that's why you see also in that period. Was that the intention that we started a war because we wanted good growth? I don't think so. I mean, the U.S. didn't start it, but do we, as economists worldwide, like wars because we want to promote growth to sustain that? I don't think that's the idea. But on the other hand, you're right. In the current context, you're saying if we have been using the debt to finance infrastructure, and then infrastructure in the U.S. is in pretty bad shape, there's no question of that. Maybe those things will be better use of the debt than having had to use it for the stabilization of the financial system. Now, I was saying at lunch in the discussion of the multipliers, when the crisis started, I kind of wrote things on some of this opinion media where I was basically making that case that, in fact, we were going to put money into fiscal multipliers with an unlikely hope that it will work, that the money was better used to stabilize the financial system. It was not going to be productive in that tangible sense, but in the sense that without stabilizing the financial system, everything else was going to fall apart. So it was an investment into the future, right? That heavy fiscal intervention was the only way to end the carnage in the financial system. It's passing the burden into the future generation.
There is another question from Anastasios Papas from the Hellenic Fiscal Council. He says, would like to have your view about the link between government bond yield spreads and the public debt to GDP ratio in the Eurozone during the last years. It may be puzzling that Portugal, for instance, had a public debt to GDP of 126% in 2012 and yields of 10.5%, while during 2016, with a ratio up to 130, the yields were much significantly lower at 3.17%. Similar is the picture for Italy, Spain, and other European economies. Does the ratio matter, or other reasons are more important? For instance, Draghi's commitment for euro, quantitative easing, herd behavior, investment sentiment, speculation, etc. Furthermore, may other indices like the interest rate payments to GDP, cost of debt service, is more important for debt sustainability than the ratio of public debt to GDP? Do we give more important role to the public debt to GDP ratio that we should have?
I see. Okay, so the question, as I take it, is kind of worry about why spreads have fallen so much if the ratios haven't fallen so much. It is a good question. Okay, so one very important thing. All these calculations of the sustainability that I showed you, except for the discussion about the potential for default for redistribution, everything else, all these calculations of these fiscal reaction functions, these neoclassical models, these Laffer curves, all of these things in their theory assume that the governments are committed to repay. So they assume away the problem that the question very rightly so is bringing up, which is in those spreads what you have, since the currency is common, in those spreads what you have is a risk of default. Just like in the credit default swaps, what you have are market measures of the risk of default. What the decline, by definition, I guess you would say, what the decline in the spreads tells you is that the market perception of the risk of default is significantly lower. Now, this is typical of what a debt crisis looks like. This is also true for the external defaults and for the domestic defaults. If you look at the Reinhard Rogoff paper, is they always look like people want to start favoring multiplicity and animal spirits and whatnot, because what it looks like is that you went through years with zero spreads, and then one unhappy morning things went like this. And they went up very fast, and then default and all kinds of nasty things start to happen. So they seem to happen so suddenly that we tended to think that there is something kind of strange or magic about what is going on. But what theory tells us in the standard models of sovereign default is that this is exactly the way it should happen. that when you start questioning or when you start looking at the fiscal situation from a country, about its, they're not so much about its capacity to repay. You see, all the numbers that, again, we were talking about here with these fiscal reaction functions, it's about capacity. It's not about what the future primary balance looks like. In most models of sovereign default, what you're looking at is a willingness, the strategic incentives for the government to default. So the question is quite right that if you realign incentives, and if you realign beliefs in the market that, you know, you say things like we do whatever it takes and stuff like that, you start thinking maybe the risk of default is actually lower. So spreads go lower. Does that mean the risk of default has disappeared from the system? No. But does it mean that, that as you make the probability that the government may actually not repay lower, that actually is true? And you can see other structural things to the extent that you make government and sovereign debts comparable as security instruments for stuff like financial regulation, then you're also generating more sustainable demand for these instruments. So if you change the regime in a way that you make demand for these instruments more stable, you also are going to change. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm saying it's a fact of life. So the question is quite right, but the question highlights more the issue of the risk of non-repayment of the debt rather than the sustainability of it.
Thank you very much. I think it's very interesting discussion and questions. We are going to move now to the second presentation by Professor Dominique on budgetary stability and structural reforms in Spain. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Let me first thank your kind invitation. For me, it's a pleasure to be here at this seminar organized by AIReF, and thank you for the audience to also attend to this seminar. I will present, this is a presentation that is based on two different contributions by José Manuel González Páramo and I. One for the Spanish economy, okay, and there is, this is, the first is a paper, and the second is a presentation that in which we extend some of the results and the analysis to other European countries, okay? Well, the aim of this presentation is to analyze the challenge in terms of public debt sustainability, as in the previous paper, after the financial crisis for the Spanish economy, given the uncertainty in real long-term interest rates, and also given the uncertainty in potential growth. Here in this presentation, I will present 4 different exercises. The first is an illustration of a sustainability model proposed by Olivier Blanchard in 1984. The second is an extension of this analysis to a comparison between the Spain and the United Kingdom, okay, because in the case of the Spanish economy, we have seen a debt sustainability crisis, not in the case of the United Kingdom, and we think that this is very interesting to compare these two experiences to obtain some lessons, both for the Spanish economy and for the construction of the European and Monetary Union. And these two last exercises are the following. In the first, it's very similar and complementary to the one presented by Enrique Mendoza before. What is the burden of the debt, of public debt in terms of growth? Okay, if we stabilize debt in a higher level, what is the amount of growth that we are losing because of that? And the second exercise is just in the second exercise, we analyze the reverse causation effect. Is to what extent an improvement in long-term growth, in particularly a reduction in the structural unemployment rate, could help to reduce the level of public debt. Okay. Well, let me go to the first exercise. Okay, it's very simple. Okay, the first is very similar. This is the law of motion of public debt in terms of GDP. D is the debt, T is public revenues, J is public expenditure, R is the interest rate, and gamma is the nominal rate of growth. Okay, it was exactly the same equation presented before by Enrique, and then there is a second equation that is the fiscal rule. Okay, this is the primary, the change in the primary surplus. Okay, and this is the fiscal reaction function. Okay, this was the parameter rho in the previous slides. Here we call this this parameter alpha. Okay, then we have two equations, and these two equations represent the whole dynamics of this very simple model. Okay, when you solve the model, you obtain this equation number 4. This is the convergent path of the primary budget balance and public debt to the steady state. Okay, and we can, calibrating this equation, the different parameters of this equation, we can represent this equation for different countries. Okay, I'm not going to discuss all the assumptions in terms of the calibration of the different parameters. All the calibration is described here in the presentation. Some of the, by the way, some of the parameters that we are using are taken from the paper by Enrique Mendoza. Some of the papers by Enrique Mendoza, in particular this fiscal, this parameter of fiscal reaction to public debt is assumed to be 0.1. Okay, and then given these assumptions, you obtain something like this. Okay, the horizontal axis is the public debt. The vertical axis is the primary budget balance, both in terms of GDP. Each point is a different year, okay? And the green line here are the primary balance combination in which the the public debt is in a steady state, okay? And this red dotted line, this is the saddle path, okay? This is the convergence path to a maximum debt level, okay, that here has been calibrated to 150% of GDP, okay? Then this red line divides this space in two different regions. This is the sustainability region and this is the unsustainability region, okay? And you can see that during the expansion from 1995 to 2007, the Spanish economy was moving from very clear to this area in which there were no sustainability problems for the public accounts, but then because of the crisis, then there has been a movement first here and then very close to the line, to this red line in 2009, 2010, 2011. Okay, it took several years until 2014, 2015 to move in a different path that, according to the stability program, the last stability program presented to the European Commission, if we achieve the different fiscal targets, okay, we move again to this very clearly to this sustainability region with no problems in terms of the stability of public debt. Okay, it's very clear that if we stop around this area here, the level of public debt will be in a steady state larger than in the previous expansionary period. Okay, but this is something that we don't know yet. But the question is that it's very interesting how, with very two simple equations and only few parameters, we can represent these years in which the Spanish economy was so close to be in this unsustainable region. Okay, but what is also very interesting is that if we present the same exercise with the same calibration for the United Kingdom, the graph is very, very similar. Okay, in fact, it took a time just to compare the Spanish experience with the United Kingdom. Okay, you can see that the more or less the years were very similar: 2009, 2010, 2011. Okay, the same years in which, according to this calibration, the United Kingdom was in a very similar fiscal situation. But what is surprising is that if you compare the spreads, okay, in this case the 10-year government bond yields, you can see that in the case of the Spanish economy, there was a sovereign debt crisis, okay, but in the case of the United Kingdom, that is the blue line, okay, the lighter blue line here, was the opposite, okay, the interest rate continued to be decreasing during this period, very similar to the United States. That was the sample discussed previously, okay, and slightly above Germany, more clearly in the last part of the sample, okay, but it's a very different experience to the Spanish case, okay. In a complementary presentation, we have looked at other countries in Europe, and with the same calibration, you can obtain a very interesting illustration of what happened during the sovereign debt crisis. It was very clear why the Greece economy defaulted, why the Irish economy or the Portuguese economy were rescued, and why other countries like the French or German, in that case, it did not happen, or they have very low interest rates, okay? But let me, and this is the second exercise, let me discuss this, or try to explain these differences between the Spanish and the United Kingdom cases, okay? Well, a first potential explanation is that for some, at least for some authors, is that the possibility of self-defeating austerity, okay? That this is theoretically an interesting question, okay? It could happen that Spain started the fiscal consolidation too soon, and this created, was self-defeating fiscal consolidation, and this created this sovereign debt crisis, okay? Our view is completely different. We think that causality was in the opposite direction, okay? Fiscal consolidation was the consequence of the sovereign debt crisis, and not sovereign debt crisis the consequence of fiscal consolidation. If this happens, then when the risk premium is high, the prudent fiscal policy is to avoid expansionary fiscal policy and to implement the structural reforms, as I analyzed in the last part of the presentation. Okay, and what is very important. Okay, in fact, the fiscal adjustment after 2010 was nothing other than a partial reversion of the fiscal stimuli applied in 2008-2009, and was similar or even less intense than in the United Kingdom. Here you have some evidence. Okay, this is total public expenditure in per capita terms. It has been normalized at the beginning of the crisis 2007, equal to 100. Here you can see the fiscal stimulus in 2008-2009 was even greater than in the case of the United Kingdom, very similar to the United States. This is for total public expenditure, but if I exclude interest and the debt burden, and also I exclude here public investment, you can see that in terms of the fiscal stimulus was even larger in Spain, that is the darker blue line, than in the United Kingdom, okay? And if you look at the total public revenues, okay, and this is here, there are other reasons that I will explain right now, okay? But you can see that the fall in public revenues was larger than in the case of the United Kingdom, okay? Then you can argue that if austerity cannot explain the sovereign debt crisis, just the opposite, okay? Because austerity was, if any, was similar or less intense in Spain than the United Kingdom, okay? Well, how we can explain then these differences between the Spain and the United Kingdom, okay? And well, this is the same as to admit that just two simple equations cannot explain the whole dynamics of public debt or the whole dynamics of interest rates, because there are other things that are also important, okay? And here you have a very comprehensive list of other factors. The first is macroeconomic imbalances. The second is the restructuring of the financial sector that started in Spain at least 3 years later than in the United Kingdom. The rigidity of the labor market, very different in the case of the United Kingdom and Spain. If you think that the financial markets were also reacting to the different increases in the unemployment rate, both in the United Kingdom or in the Spanish economy, because of the rigidities in the economy and also rigidities in the labor market, this could partially explain these differences. Okay, very important, and I will discuss right now. A very important difference is that the expectation of low growth and low inflation, and remember that there is a very big difference between the United Kingdom and the Spanish economy, is the control of monetary policy, okay, and this create different circumstances or different expectations in terms of low inflation. The sudden stop in foreign lending, very important in an economy with many macroeconomic imbalances, and also very important when you are in a currency union, there are redenomination risks. Okay, this is not the case for the United Kingdom. These were national determinants, but there were also some EMU determinants. The first is that the EMU rules did not prevent macroeconomic imbalances before the crisis. There was not a full banking union, just only after 2014. The ECB was not a credible lender of last resort compared to the Bank of England until August 2012. Okay, the euro appreciated, the pound depreciated, just the opposite. The lack of a fiscal union, the fact that the Spanish economy was a small open economy in a currency union also makes or could or helps to explain the differences between the different performance of the Spanish economy and the United Kingdom, that you cannot explain with just two simple equations of debt dynamics. Okay. The third exercise is the effect of higher public debt on economic growth. This was very similar to the unpleasant fiscal arithmetics presented before. Enrique presented the results in terms of dynamic Laffer curves. Here the exercise is different. There has been a lot of previous literature trying to estimate the effects of the public debt in terms of GDP, GDP per capita or GDP growth. Okay, I will refer here just to two papers of this very large literature. One is Elmendorf and Mankiw. Okay, according to the calibration of this author, this is the effect. 0.08 is the effect of the increase of 1 percentage point of public debt in terms of GDP, the effect on output. Okay, and this has been estimated using the results of a paper published by Bu and Kumar. We have estimated the density function, and you can see that the median that is here is more or less the same as the effect estimated by or calibrated by Elmendorf and Mankey. Okay, these two very different approaches obtain a very similar result. And what is very interesting is that when we apply a dynamic general equilibrium model calibrated for the Spanish economy, for a small open economy in a currency union, we obtain very similar results. Okay, in fact, here I present the effects of a permanent increase in public debt from 36% to 100%. This is what we have observed in the Spanish economy. The effects on GDP, for example, when we increase all taxes to make public debt sustainable at that level. And here you have the different exercises when you increase just indirect taxes and not all the taxes, when you increase labor income tax, social contribution, or capital income tax. Okay, just look at this number. Okay, this is the effect on the steady state, 5.5% of less GDP per capita. Okay, because of this increase of 74 percentage point of public debt. Okay, if you divide 5.5 over 74, you obtain almost the same number as here in a very different method. Okay, it's very interesting to see that the metrics are very similar. Okay, and then finally, and this is the last exercise that I will present here, we just analyze the causality in the other direction. Okay. In the previous exercise, we have estimated the effect, the simulated effect of public debt on GDP, okay? Although you have also here private consumption, investment, employment, and public revenues, okay? Different all endogenous variables in the model. Here, the exercise is the opposite, okay? The effects of growth, of structural reforms on debt sustainability, okay? The intuition is very clear if you look at this empirical evidence. Here in this graph, you have on the horizontal axis the cyclical unemployment rate, okay, and on the vertical axis the budget balance. Okay, you can see that in most of the years, with the exception of 2008, 2009, 10, 2011. 2012 was already over or very close to this line. The Spanish economy has been moving along this line, okay, and you can say, okay, that just this line is just estimating the effect of automatic stabilizers, okay. If nothing strange happens, okay, and you let the economy just move around the cycle. Along the cycle, you obtain these different combinations. Okay, if you apply expansionary fiscal policies, then with the same level of cyclical unemployment rate, you increase the public deficit. Okay, and the intuition of why growth matters and the role of structural reforms is that if you implement the structural reforms and reduce the structural employment rate, then for this same budget balance, you will have a larger cyclical unemployment rate, and then a movement, if you let the economy to go to its equilibrium, to restore the public account balance probably in a close to balance or even a surplus in the economy. Okay, and this is the motivation of the exercise, and here you have the results using the same model as before, a calibrated model for the Spanish economy, a general equilibrium model for this small open economy in a currency union. What happens if we implement different structural policies to reduce the unemployment rate from 15.5%. This number is not casual, it's just the average of the unemployment rate for the Spanish economy from 1980 until today. Okay, the average for in the last 4 decades. If we reduce the unemployment rate, this number could be interpreted as the structural unemployment rate, the average of the structural unemployment rate, to 7.5%. Okay, a reduction of 8 points. Okay, and here you have the increase in GDP per capita, in public expenditure per capita. It's very interesting to see that implementing structural reforms, you can have expansionary fiscal policy in the very long run. Okay, because you will have larger economy with then much more public revenues. You can reduce even the rate of public revenues over GDP and reduce the public debt or GDP, restoring the initial steady state previous to the crisis. Okay, then according to this exercise, the implementation of structural reforms in the very long run could produce the same results of a similar fiscal consolidation to restore the initial steady state of public debt to GDP ratio. Okay, we can do that, implemented the structural reforms in the labor market. Also, we can implement other structural reforms to increase the productivity of the economy. What is also interesting is that part of these structural reforms could be in terms of increasing public sector efficiency. Okay, if you increase public sector efficiency, it seems that according to this evidence, if you forget these two outliers that are the Greek and Italian economy, it seems to be a positive correlation between the public sector efficiency and the size of the public sector in terms of public revenues over GDP. And it seems that when economies or when countries are more or have a public sector more efficient, the society is willing to increase or to allow for higher taxes, and then this will facilitate also the fiscal consolidation process. I will stop here just with a summary of the main conclusions of this presentation. We have seen that the sustainability of public debt in the case of the Spanish economy was on a knife edge in some years during the previous to the sovereign debt crisis. Okay, that in a currency union, as was the case of the Spanish economy, our economy had a few alternatives to deficit reduction. That, in our view, fiscal expansion was not the way to reduce the public debt to GDP ratio, just the opposite, to the implementation of fiscal consolidation measures and the implementation of structural reforms. We have seen that that the structural reforms can increase employment and productivity, and can improve also the fiscal margin and reduce the public debt the ratio very significantly. And this also applied to the increases in productivity, particularly in this process of technological and digital transformation that also applied to the public sector. We think that in the case of the Spanish economy, in an economy that still have an employment rate close to 18%, and with a large gap in terms of productivity, this is more than a fiscal policy option. The implementation of structural reforms are needed in order to converge to the levels of prosperity of the most advanced countries in Europe. I left the presentation here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Now, Pablo Nedekos is going to discuss Rafael's Dominique paper.
Yes, thank you very much, José Luis, for the invitation, and in particular also for giving me the opportunity to comment on this paper by Rafa and José Manuel. which as usual is always very nice to read because it's always a very well executed paper with very clear policy conclusions, and that it is particularly relevant not only for explaining the past but also for providing very concrete proposals for policy messages for the future. So if Rafa allows me, I will take basically the main conclusions as the starting point, and I will summarize them very briefly. So the paper is divided basically into two parts. The first one is about the past, and the second one is about the future. In the first one, my conclusions, but I think these are quotations from the paper, so I guess that Rafa can only agree with that. The first conclusion is that the Spanish fiscal position was close to unsustainable over the period 2009 and 2011. From there, the authors basically conclude that fiscal consolidation was necessary. That was basically the only option in order to face this critical unsustainability position of fiscal policy in Spain. And then they even conclude that the fiscal adjustment that was made by the different governments was very gradual and slow in an attempt to affect short-term growth as little as possible. This, I would say, that are the main three conclusions referring about the past developments of fiscal policy. Then, when they develop the analysis about the future, then again I find three main conclusions. The first one is that they still see risk, sustainability risk on the Spanish fiscal position as very high. They provide very clear evidence that high public debt has considerable cost in terms of GDP employment losses, and they defend that the best strategy now, as compared to the situation in 2009 and 2011, is one in which the reduction of this risk, the sustainability risk, should be made basically with structural reforms, but not with additional fiscal consolidation. So what I will do in my discussion is to go through all these six conclusions, and I will provide now what are my assessment of the six. So I would basically agree with the fact that the Spanish fiscal position was close to unsustainable over 2009-2011, and I will provide some more evidence than the one that was provided by Rafa. I would also conclude that fiscal consolidation was a valid option. I don't know whether I can go so further as to say that it was necessary. And here, my main, the main value added of what I would explain later is that I think the authors do not connect very well this unsustainability with the necessity of the fiscal consolidation, and I would tend to disagree with the third. So I think with the third assessment, I think that the authors, in fact, do not provide sufficient evidence in the paper to justify such a strong statement. I will not provide it either, so I will just provide several empirical findings that are quite obvious of how the fiscal adjustment was made, that I think is a bit more critical on how it was made in several dimensions. So this about the past. On the future, again, I would fully agree with the two first statements. Sustainability is still at very high risk levels or high risk levels. The empirical evidence is not only the one provided by the authors, but also the one that is in the literature, is the high public debt is bad for the economy. And I would tend also to disagree on the third one. I think rather than to defend a policy option which is basically only focused on structural reforms, which is of course an option, I would tend to think and to defend that a more prudent approach would be to do both, so structural reforms together with fiscal consolidation, which in the current macroeconomic context I think is even more advisable than it was already in 2009 and 2011. So let me go through these six conclusions. This is the first one. This is the quotation of for sure of the paper. They think and they provide empirical evidence that the situation in this period, 2009-2010, was unsustainable. What I've done here is to provide an additional indicator of the sustainability, which I like a bit more precisely because of some of the things that Rafa has said during the presentation, is that basically the indicator that they provide is basically on two equations that do not, for example, incorporate any macroeconomic considerations. And if something we've learned during the crisis is that the fiscal position, the fiscal sustainability of any country depends very much not only on fiscal variables, but also on macro imbalances, for example. No? So this is a sustainability risk score that was developed at the ECB that we are currently using at the Banco de España as well, which is a combination of deterministic DSA, the sustainability scenarios, which basically has some benchmark scenario with some adverse shock scenarios, looking at basically the developments of three variables, debt level, the dynamics, and the risks of fiscal fatigue. And it also incorporates other indicators. And among all these other indicators, I would emphasize that they include government contingent liabilities, which might stem from the private sector, but also that they incorporate the quality of institutions and even competitiveness indicators of the different economies. So these are the results till 2013, and I would emphasize that these are real-time estimates. And as you can see, well, this is the sustainability risk score, which moves from a contained sustainability risk, which is the green bar, to the top, which is very high the sustainability risk. And then it's very obvious that we were, well, in a relatively comfortable situation at the beginning of the crisis, but that we moved very quickly to a very high sustainability risk, and that already 2010, 2011, and very similar to the results presented by Rafa, we were in the verge of very high debt sustainability risk, and we even move further. I think the persistence of this indicator on providing this alarm information is that in 2012 and 2013 it was still a very high the sustainability risk which were present in the Spanish economy. So this is just to provide another piece of information on this statement by the authors. Then I will enter into the second assessment, or the second statement made by the authors. So they basically conclude, and they don't argue too much about this, is that given that fiscal sustainability was at risk, then there were few alternatives available other than reducing the fiscal deficit. And I would conclude the same, but what I miss in the paper is an argumentation of why. So, and I will explain myself. So, to argue that fiscal consolidation was a good strategy to face sustainability risks, you need at least to justify that fiscal consolidation is not self-defeating. So that it reduces the debt-to-GDP ratio, that you do fiscal consolidation and in the end the debt-to-GDP ratio declines rather than increases. And this has been, in fact, this consideration on whether this is true or not, this has been the whole story of the discussion during the crisis. So one way to face this issue is the way we did. Well, Cristina is here, one of my co-authors, with Thomas Barmedinger, both from the ECB and myself. Is well, you do the simple arithmetic, as we've seen in Enrique's presentation, and basically you could conclude that there are three variables. There might be more, but I would say that there are three main variables in order to analyze this properly, which are first the value of the fiscal multiplier. And this is why we've discussed a lot about the fiscal multiplier during the crisis. Second, the starting debt level. And third, the cyclical elasticity of the budget balance. Of course, the higher the value of the fiscal multiplier, the higher the starting debt level, the higher the cyclical elasticity of the budget balance, the more likelihood for having a self-defeating story when making a fiscal consolidation shock. So, in this paper, what we saw is basically what it is shown in this table on the left, which is the threshold size of the fiscal multiplier at which fiscal consolidation yields adverse impact on the debt-to-GDP ratio in different time horizons. Okay, so let's look, for example, to the first to Spain, which is the first country there. The initial debt-to-GDP ratio in 2012 was slightly below 90%. So if you do the arithmetics for a consolidation, fiscal consolidation shock of around 3% of GDP in period T+1, you need a multiplier higher than 0.75 in order to get a self-defeating story for the debt-to-GDP ratio for one time period. Of course, if you move to a time period of 5 years, then you would need a fiscal multiplier of 1.6, so much higher multiplier. Then, just as a way of comparison, if you move down to Greece, for a country with a very high debt-to-GDP ratio at that moment, and still now, of course, close to 180%, the value of the multiplier that provides a self-defeating story is much lower. In the case of, for example, for just the consideration of one period, it was close to 0.5. So then the issue is that, of course, given the initial debt level, given that the cyclical elasticity of the budget balance for most European countries is basically the same, around between 0.4 and 0.6, because this depends very much on the size of the public revenues to GDP, and there is not much variance there among countries. The important thing is then the fiscal multiplier. So, is the value of the fiscal multiplier, or was the value of the fiscal multiplier higher than this around 0.8 that was in the table? Well, and this is empirical evidence that the authors use, we have some evidence also, as in the US case, for state-dependent multipliers. So we find evidence in this paper with Enrique Moral from Banco de España that depending on whether we are in expansion or recession, the multiplier changes. In both cases, we find Keynesian multipliers, but that they are much higher in the case of recession than in the case of expansion. But something that it is not mentioned in the paper, and it was also mentioned by Enrique, is that we do find in this same paper also evidence that it is not, the state-dependent multiplier discriminates very well between expansion and recessions, but it discriminates also very well between good fiscal times and bad fiscal times. So when we have evidence, as Enrique was saying, that in this case, the indicator variable was the change in gross debt, but you can use also the level of the gross debt. When you are in a bad fiscal times, the multiplier are basically close to zero. And of course, in 2011 and 2012, we were in a combination of these two scenarios. We were in a recession, which might justify higher multiplier, but we were also in bad fiscal times, which tend to show multipliers that are close to zero. In the paper by Enrique and myself, we provide a weighted average of these state-dependent variables, and we see that there are no arguments to think that the multiplier during that period was higher than this 0.7 that I was showing there before as the threshold. Another way to look at this is, and this is something that we did in the annual report 3 years ago at Banco de España, is to reply this exercise by Blanchard and Ley. If you remember well this paper, they basically make the point that by correlating the forecast of fiscal consolidation that the IMF was doing at that time with the errors, the forecast errors of GDP, they find that there was a negative correlation between these two variables. And they made the argument that this was basically because the IMF forecasting models had a multiplier of around 0.5, that given that these models were not taking into consideration that the countries were in a recession, in fact, the multiplier were much higher. And the main evidence that we were providing was precisely this graph that is here on the left. So we did this same exercise with the forecast errors of Banco de España. We know that, you know that we publish these projections every quarter now. And as you can see, and this is the right-hand chart, and again, in the case of the Banco de España, also our forecasting models for a tax expenditure shock use the multipliers around 0.4. So the three main evidence that we provide under this calculation is first that not all forecast errors have the same sign. Okay, this is important. There were even positive errors at that time. That they were very much reduced when controlling for changes in external assumptions. So, of course, when you do this type of exercise, it's not only that you make mistakes on fiscal consolidation or on the multiplier, but also on other external assumptions. And in this case, external assumptions such as the growth of the euro area was an important factor to explain the errors. And also that projections errors were not negatively correlated with fiscal consolidation. So this is, I take it at least, as another piece of evidence that we don't have any evidence in Spain that the multipliers were so high. With this evidence or with this argumentation, I think you are now in a position to say that at least fiscal consolidation was not self-defeating, so that it was able to fight against the sustainability risk that were the main concern at that moment. And then on the third statement, again, I don't find in the paper any justification for this sentence, and it's a very strong assessment, by the way. The fiscal adjustment was very gradual and slow in an attempt to affect short-term growth as little as possible. I think for at least trying to cover this topic, which is a very complex one, by the way, you need at least to do a deeper analysis on the composition and the timing of fiscal consolidation. And I find arguments to defend this sentence and some other arguments to basically contradict that. I would say that contradict it. For example, if you look at the composition of the fiscal consolidation, it's very simply around half of it, of the reduction in the public deficit, was done through public investment. And I mean, in your model, probably also, Rafa, the higher multiplier that you get is for public investment as well. But then even you were talking about the timing of fiscal consolidation, and look at the graph on the left, which is basically the change in the structural primary balance. The consolidation period started in 2010, and what you have basically there is a very erratic, consolidation process with very slow expansionary, contractionary fiscal policy in 2010 and 11, very strong in 2012 and 13, and even it has become expansionary in 2015 and 2016. But it's not only that, it's also that we know that there have been significant slippages, deviation from the fiscal targets, completely lack of detail of medium-term plans, which I think they have not helped in order to provide certainty to agents, which is also a very important element for having low multipliers. On the other side, something that is not even is not also mentioned in the paper. One of the main and important things that were done to guarantee sustainability during this period are precisely pension reforms. And this is, I'm emphasizing this because I think it was also the IMF in the World Economic Outlook of 2010 that was, at the same time that they were asking for having a very gradual fiscal consolidation, they were asking for having a reform of pension entitlements or health entitlements in order to guarantee fiscal sustainability in the long term, but with low short-term multipliers in the short run. And this is something that was done in the Spanish case, no? And Rafa has studied it very, very carefully. What you have in the right-hand chart is basically the increase in pension expenditure expected pension expenditure between 2020 and 2060. The blue line is before any reform. You know that we had two reforms, the one in 2012 and the 2015. The one in 2012 was already capable to reduce a lot of the contingent liabilities that were behind these pension expenditure projections. And in 2015, I mean, the improvement has been dramatic, I would say. No? This is something that is, when talking about sustainability, I think is important also to be mentioned. So I will be a bit quicker on the future. So again, the authors claim that the sustainability of public finance, although it has improved, there are still risks, and I provide here an update of the indicator I was just referring before, and the conclusion is the same. It's true that we have moved from this red bar to this orange bar, but this orange bar is labeled high debt sustainability risk. So I think there is a clear concern on the sustainability still today in Spain, despite the improvement. I cannot more than agree on this statement of, and they provide a very interesting empirical evidence on public debt representing a high cost in terms of GDP per capita. Perhaps my two comments here is one that is the one that is shown in the graph, is illustrated in the graph by a paper by Pescarotti, is that the most recent empirical evidence is emphasizing very much that this relationship between the level of public debt and GDP per capita or employment and unemployment depends not only on the level but also on the direction of whether the debt level is increasing or reducing. And then on the channels why this debt to GDP ratio might have cost in terms of GDP per capita, I think one that is particularly relevant for the following years, which is the second one, which is incorporated into this slide. So basically, because it reduces the room for maneuver available for fiscal policy to play a countercyclical role. This is particularly relevant for a country which is incorporated into the monetary union, which is basically we don't have any other tool to fight for idiosyncratic shocks. And I think it's even more important in a context in which most of the academia is pointing to the fact that it's very, very likely that in the next decade, the probability of being at the zero lower bound for monetary policy is very, very high. So I think it's very important that that fiscal policy gains again the room for maneuver in order to do fiscal stabilization. And then my final point the authors claim basically, and this is the sentence I've taken from the paper, that in the current conjuncture, the best strategy in order to face the sustainability risks that still remain is to do structural reforms. And they claim that this might be a full substitute of fiscal consolidation. So in principle, I don't have any argument against this. If you believe in the numbers that the authors provide, or even the numbers that I could provide with the models of the Banco de España, I would completely agree with it. But, and this is the but I want to introduce in the discussion, we have to acknowledge that there is a lot of uncertainty on the precise impact and also on the timing, on the lags of structural reforms on potential or even observed GDP growth. So given this uncertainty, and given also the fact that if the estimated impact is not confirmed, or that the lags are longer than we initially expect, postponing consolidation could exacerbate fiscal sustainability risk and increase the consolidation needs. So my point would be, I think, is a more prudent approach to have a combination of structural reforms that could reduce the damage done on the short term for fiscal consolidation, in particular in a context on which we have a more positive economic outlook, and then the multipliers should be lower now than they were in the crisis. And also, and this is a very important factor, we have to also to take into account that we are in a context of very high accommodative monetary policy, which is also, of course, helping to reduce these multipliers. I will not enter into this. I mean, I've provided here 2 slides. I guess that the AIReF will publish the slides as well, so you can read them. Here is basically a simulation of the first of the points I was making. Of the red line is the scenario on which I decide today to do fiscal consolidation, and of course it has negative effects on growth. And the green bar is one on which I postpone consolidation and imagine that the effects that Rafa was emphasizing on structural reforms do not materialize. So that in the end, in 3 or 4 years, I have to do the fiscal consolidation that I have not started to do today. So, of course, I have to put a kind of benchmark of the GDP ratio for both scenarios. And as you can see, the fiscal shock that I will have to do in 3 or 4 or 5 years' times will be much higher. And, of course, the cost in terms of GDP growth will be much higher at that time. This is another simulation that was done with the model prepared by Andrés Arce and Carlos Tomás from the bank, on which to show that, probably the GDP cost of doing the 3 things, so to have fiscal consolidation on the one side, to add structural reforms, and then accompany this with accommodative monetary policy, in the end, which is the combination of these 3 shocks, is basically the green bar, will in the end provide also positive numbers, and it will be safer from the point of view of fiscal sustainability, as I was pointing before. Just 2 final comments, which are related about the past and about the future. Something that I miss in the paper is, and I think is very relevant in order to explain the developments of public finances in Spain during the last 6 years, is the role played by monetary policy. Monetary policy has already alleviated significantly the budget constraint. We already provided in the annual report this year some numbers on what the impact of quantitative easing of the ECB asset purchase program had on not only the European Monetary Union but also in Spain. And as you can see in this table, the numbers are very large. You have to take into account that we are considering here not only the direct impact on interest rate, which is the most obvious, but also those derived from the GDP growth. Of course, quantitative easing had an impact, a positive impact on GDP growth of Spain and European Monetary Union, and this, of course, had a positive impact on the public balances. And then finally, and also related to what Enrique was pointing before, we also have some evidence that the fiscal reaction function of the Spanish governments, and here, of course, we don't have 2 centuries in order to provide for very robust estimations. But we did the same exercise that Enrique was describing before for the US, here for the Spanish case. What you have here is basically the reaction function of the government to the primary balance, to the debt to GDP ratio of the previous year. And as you can see, the blue bar is basically the coefficient that it is estimated when you cut the sample to 2012, and the whatever that's the color, the green bar is the one that you estimate with the full sample till 2016. And as you can see, it's much lower, which is this will be published in a paper that we are currently producing at the PAN. We take this as another element to be very sensitive on fiscal issues. We tend to think that this is an illustration that there is some fiscal fatigue in the fiscal reaction of the Spanish government that in our view is a matter of concern. And I will stop here.
Will you react to?
Yeah, yes. Very quickly, I agree with all of your comments, Pablo. Just let me focus on 4 of them, starting by the end. The role of monetary policy was crucial, and this is why we compare Spain with the United Kingdom, and this is just to say the different roles that during the crisis had the ECB and the Bank of England during the crisis. This could help to explain the sovereign debt crisis in Spain. The second point is the role of structural reforms. I also completely agree. Our point here was to illustrate that the effects could achieve exactly the same as fiscal consolidation, but in a virtuous way. Okay, but if you think that there is a lot of uncertainty and about the effects and about the lags, then it's very obvious that you will need a plan B in terms of fiscal consolidation. In terms of another comment that we still think that the fiscal adjustment was very gradual and slow on average. And when we talk on average, it's talking across time, okay, not year per year, but for the whole period, and across policies, okay, because as I mentioned also in the presentation, it's very clear that in the case of public investment, there was a very significant difference, okay, with respect to other policies. Then, if any, we need to extend our claim, saying that the fiscal adjustment was very gradual and slow on average, trying also to reduce the political cost as much as possible, because probably for the government is for the different public administrations, is easier to reduce public investment than other public expenditures. And with respect to your first comment about the fiscal consolidation was not self-defeating, this is we think that is discussed in the paper, not here in the presentation. I said that we did not present here the results of the conditions in terms of the different fiscal multipliers, and also in terms of the hysteresis parameter. That is also very important, the hysteresis that in the rate of growth of the Spanish economy. And as we mentioned in the paper, we completely agree with your evidence. In fact, we have done exactly the same exercise that you presented here, replicating Blanchard and Leg results for the Spanish regions. Then this is an exercise that is devoted and particularly designed for the Spanish economy, that we are not contaminating the Spanish evidence with the evidence of other European countries. That's using data of Spanish regions, and we obtain exactly the same result. That is very difficult to attain fiscal multipliers that in the order of magnitude that could satisfy the conditions needed to have a self-defeating fiscal consolidation.
Okay. A remark which goes in the direction of something that Pablo has said. I tend to believe that while not disputing the need for structural reforms, by no means, seems to me that the metrics that have been chosen in the paper to illustrate and to quantify the impact leads to overemphasizing the emphasis. And the reason for that is the following. Unlike something Pablo has said, explaining singular in the sense that the cyclicality of the fiscal policy is very much on the expenditure side and precisely on because of the generosity of the unemployment benefits, which together with the fact that macro adjustment in Spain is primarily driven by job shedding, plus the fact that the structural employment is very high. All this factor implies that through a reduction, which is the proxy that is used in the paper to identify the structural reform by a very significant reduction in the unemployment rate, basically you have a huge positive impact on the primary deficit. But what is behind that is exactly what I have said. In a way, this could be circular to the extent that part of the structural reform were to be a reduction in the generosity of the employment benefit. That has been argued by some that this is one of the channels where you can have improvements in the functioning of the labor market. Basically, the picture would be very different, because the cyclicality of the budget would be very much diminished. And when you make a detailed analysis and disaggregate the analysis of the cyclicality of the fiscal policy in Spain, you realize how different it is from most countries, and it has to do precisely because of that. So my sense is that if you were to do the analysis with potential GDP instead of structural unemployment reductions of productivity shock or whatever, my sense is that probably while getting certainly positive results, probably the outcome would be not as large as what is shown in the paper. It's just a qualification before asking a question from the floor. Any remarks, questions? Please, go ahead. Well,
thank you. Well, sorry. Another question. So what's interesting, which is something which is common in the second presentation, the discussion, and the previous one, is that okay, the levels are high, and in a sense, I mean, given the current situation in the European case or the Spanish case, they support monetary policy, which is assumably going to last. So this process of debt deleveraging is going to take some time, okay? And this is when you see this chart with the spikes. I mean, typically the length of the deleveraging process period, I mean, it can be longer or shorter. So in a sense, I mean, now the perspectives, given lower potential output growth in the current situation, an outlook of global high public debt everywhere, I mean, put us into a perspective in which, I mean, this process is going to take a long time. So most of the arguments that are here are kind of backward-looking arguments. No, so we draw a lot of insights from this fiscal reform function, from policy simulations, from a lot of things. No, but in a sense, something which is missing, I wanted to have the view of Rafa, because in the RES model or this thing is, which is a role of kind of anchoring expectations of agents in the process of fiscal consolidation. It's like in monetary policy. I mean, we have this struggle with the low inflation and the issue of anchoring expectation of agents in when to get back, I mean, to some inflation path. No? So in a sense, I mean, which would be the role of well-anchoring expectation of that the fiscal process is going to move ahead, also compared to the alternatives, which is pure fiscal consolidation or these other structural reforms. Thank you.
Okay, please.
Yeah. I think that your point is very important, Javier. Anchoring expectation is crucial, but not only in fiscal policy, also in other in different variables that affect this process of fiscal consolidation that are related with the fiscal consolidation process. Okay, like for example, the response of the financial markets in terms of the risk premium to this to these benefits of fiscal consolidation through structural reforms. Okay, if agents It's exactly the same argument that was provided before by Pablo about, for example, the public pension reform. Okay, if the market expects that because of these reforms you are going to reduce the public debt level, then the risk premium will fall, and this is an additional mechanism that operates through the model. Okay, and exactly the same as anchoring the expectation of potential reductions of the implicit tax rates. Okay, because just is the same exercise in reverse. Okay, if you want to stabilize the public debt level to a higher level of GDP, then you need to increase the taxes. Okay, but in order to sustain a fixed level of public expenditure, if you are going to reduce the public debt level in order to finance the same level of public expenditure over the GDP, you will need also smaller implicit tax rates. And this creates expectations that through different mechanisms promote higher investment rate by private agents, higher hiring rates in labor markets, things like that. Okay, and this is why we call this the virtuous cycle. Okay, here all these expectations operate in different channels and are really very relevant in order to have these results.
Any further question? Yes, please.
Question. Just to play a bit devil advocate. So in this, the new debate on secular stagnation that is now unfolding. So with aging leading to the saving glut. Low inflation, low interest rate. Many people calling actually for higher debt levels to, let's say, increase the equilibrium interest rate and maybe increase inflation. So how would maybe both of you would respond to this type of literature? I mean, there are very extreme views, even calling, basically saying that democracies are not well suited for this type of balance sheet depressions, so it's very difficult to actually to persuade people to have high debt. So it's not a question of having a low debt, but one would need to have higher debt now to restore this equilibrium in view of aging and secular stagnation. So what would be your reaction to this new debate?
I'm sure that you are prepared to answer.
I don't know. No, I'm prepared to say a couple of questionable remarks. So before we talk about secular stagnation, we were talking about the great moderation. Yeah. And then that went out with the wind. And yeah, so it's a joke of, who was it, Churchill joke about the economies. So I think some of it is true. I mean, it is true in some situations, like in Japan. What models would predict is that demographics is a big driver of what's going on, and that's actually good for them to sustain their high debt levels. I find it very difficult to explain the high demand for global assets of the U.S. without other factors where demography points in the opposite direction. And the source of that demand that comes from the emerging markets is pointing in the opposite directions because the demographics actually play against that. So you need other ingredients. So I'm not saying that demographics are not part of the story. I think demographics are part of the story. But I think that saving glut, so you think about the demand for international reserves coming from China, from India, from the rest of the emerging markets. When you come on the other side of the supply of data the US is issuing, a lot of it is being bought by these markets, by official buyers. So there's something else going on. And that's why I was trying to hint about, I ran out of time. There is something about the financial system that worries me, and that I think eventually we will have to question. whether there is this large demand that is there to stay and therefore is badly needed to issue this debt because this debt is being demanded, as opposed to there are frictions, there are forces in world markets. The long-term historical view, this is the last thing I'll say, is also kind of interesting. It's a good view to think about it. I don't know if it's democracy, but we have been through episodes in history where openness and integration have been very high, and then they have reverted considerably. And obviously, if the process of financial re-regulation is also a process of financial, even if it's gradual closing, that means all these forces get into reverse. So financial deglobalization in the same environment I was talking about as a way to explain why there was so much demand for those assets will be a process that will reduce the demand for those assets. So I worry about these sort of things. That there are these long waves in history about these things. I don't necessarily think it's about democracy, but it is about the way we think generally about stuff like openness versus autarky. I mean, autarky, the system of financial autarky the world walked out of in the 1980s was the system we thought was a good system when we ended World War II, because we thought that having fixed exchange rates and this managed gold standard through the arrangement of the snakes and the IMF was a good way to go. So Mendoza is not a big idea about democracy, but it's about the way we think, the understandings of the financial system should be.
Just very few comments. I think that there is a lot of uncertainty if we are in a scenario of secular stagnation or not. Okay, but even if we assume that we are in such a scenario, okay. If this is a problem or not in terms of the sustainability of public accounts, this will depend on different things. The first is that if you have lower growth, lower potential growth, but at the same time you have lower interest rates, then this affect the speed of convergence to the steady state, but not very much to the sustainability of public debt. Okay? And in any case, this could be an interesting question for countries that are at the frontier, at the technological frontier, or at the frontier in terms of employment, of productivity, and then in terms of GDP per capita. In the case of the Spanish economy, I think that this is a second-order problem, because what is much more important is the gap between your current position and the frontier. Okay, this only is the same problem as if you're in the frontier. If you not implement, or you renounce to implementing policies to reduce this gap in terms of employment of productivity, but for the Spanish economy, the Spanish economy could be 2-3 decades growing at a very acceptable rate of growth, just closing the gap with the frontier, if not totally, at least partially. If you don't close the gap, then you will have the same secular stagnation as if you are in the frontier as the countries like the United States. But then you are not reducing the structural employment rate, you are not reducing the gap in terms of productivity, the structural gap in terms of productivity, and then I think that the problem is much worse.
Okay, I think it's time to close this seminar. Thank you very much to two speakers and discussants for this very comprehensive presentation and issue, the sustainability that had many angles to be looked at, and certainly is key to the activities of an institution like us. Is key to our responsibilities and to the independent fiscal institutions. Many of them have been watching this seminar also through the streaming. Okay, thank you again, and let's see you next time with a new seminar here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.